Now on Life Matters, we're taking you to a dark place inside the mind of a killer. You're not actually meeting one, but you are meeting a man who's been studying the brains of violent psychopaths to try and figure out how a killer's brain differs from a normal one. Professor of Psychiatry and Human Behaviour at the University of California, James Fallon, is fascinated by the biological basis for different behaviours. In the process of doing his research, he's found out something rather interesting about his own family. We'll get to that a bit later because he's on the line now. Hello, Jim.
Richard, how do you do?
I'm really well. You found these differences between normal brains and the brains of killers, and it's to do with this specific region just above and behind the eyes. Is it that simple, though? Is it something we can say, well, look, if you don't have activity in this area, you're going to be a killer?
No. What I saw was that there were this one group that had these changes, but other people, other types of people who are not killers, also have this part of their brain that's kind of turned down.
Right.
But given the groups that I was looking at, normals, schizophrenics, and the killers, it just so happened that all of those people were killers that had that area of the brain turned off, the orbital cortex and the front part of the temporal lobe. So the logic is a little different. It's not you can just see that and then say this person's a killer.
The other thing that always comes into this is the effect of genes, and I know something like a tendency to violence. It's going to be a multifactorial thing for genes, but some genes in particular are implicated, aren't they, Jim?
Correct. There's total of right now about 10 candidate genes that are thought to be highly associated with aggression, violence, and a lack of bonding with other people. Probably the best known one, the one that's most studied, the so-called warrior gene, even though there's probably lots of so-called warrior genes, is the MAOA, monoamine oxidase A gene. And of course, there's one form of the gene which is called high risk, and if you inherit that from either your mother or father or both, then that is correlated with aggression. You can also inherit the low-risk form of that gene, and usually these type of people are mellower and harder to get to be angry. Now, with about 10 genes so far known to affect this, you can, through a roll of the dice, through just after fertilization, just how things shake out, which sperm is fertilizing the eggs, then you could end up with potentially 10 high-risk violence-related genes or 10 sort of mellow-related genes. Most people, just like at any casino, in the genetics casino, they tend to get half and half, 5-5, 4-6, something like that.
Yeah.
But some people, a very low percentage, can inherit all of these. These people are really pretty amped up in terms of their aggressiveness.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we make these people CEOs and presidents, of course. It doesn't make them criminals, but it makes them very assertive.
Yes, indeed. But we are learning more and more about this all the time, of course. But one thing that is clear is that it's not just a matter of genes or even a matter of structures in the brain. The upbringing, the nurture part of this is critical, isn't it?
Yeah, Richard, I had always thought that the genes really control behavior tremendously, and that, there was an environmental effect, but not so much. Well, the more I've looked at this the past couple of years, I've kind of changing my mind a bit here. Now, we know about epigenetics, that is, some of the factors involved in the interaction of genetics, your genes, and environment, especially stressful environment. And that leads to not only stress, but this idea of how early abuse in childhood. We're not talking about getting slapped or spanked. We're talking about pretty severe abuse. It could be emotional or physical or sexual abuse. That sort of level of stress and abuse can change which genes get turned on and how much they get turned on or off. So you're handed this set of genes, but then the environment, especially early on, with these strong stressors, will change the level of these that are expressed. And this seems to be the way that these early stressors can affect ultimately how you behave and who you become. Because early on, it can change the actual structure of the brain.
Yes, indeed. On Life Matters, if you've just joined us, we're talking to Jim Fallon. He's a neuroscientist. He's Professor of Psychiatry and Human Behaviour at the School of Medicine, University of California at Irvine in California. And we are talking about, the minds of killers, really. Now, Jim, you were well into this research when you actually discovered from something I think your mother said that actually you had good reason to look at it a bit harder.
Yeah, this came as completely out of the blue, a real surprise. A couple of different elements came together. First of all, I had a long-standing interest in this. I was studying this, and I was actually giving talks around the world in the United States about the brains of psychopathic killers and some theories about them. And my mother, at a family party, we have a large family, and we all like to talk. But anyway, she had just been alerted to a book that had been published, and it's called Killed Strangely. And it happened to be, it's a historical book about my direct great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Thomas Cornell, and he was the first person in the colonies here, and in 1660, to kill his mother. And, that was bad enough.
Yes.
That's not the way you want to be remembered as a family. But there were 7 subsequent murderers in this line that came to us through the Cornells. The last one we know, we haven't been able to follow much after the beginning of the 20th century, but, for example, Lizzie Borden is a cousin of ours.
Right, she's well known even here.
Is she? Okay, yeah, it's a famous case that was really unsettled, it really never quite settled. But anyway, so there's a long lineage of this, and as we've found out recently, there's another line of violent people in our family. So she tells me this, she goes, look at Jim, I know you're going around giving talks on this, but you got to look at your own house here. Because and she was very, very quick to point out that it was my father's side.
Yes, I wondered if it was her side.
Yeah, no, she with a little bit of glee, she said that, I think, with a little twinkle in her eye. Anyway,
the bad blood comes from your dad.
Absolutely. So anyway, I got the book and read it, and I was, oh my God. So also, just by happenstance, I had our family enrolled in an Alzheimer's study because my wife's father and mother had just died of Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
We were freaked out for kids and the grandkids if they got the high-risk ApoE4 genes, and it's really bad if you get both of these, a certain mix. And, of course, we had to ask everybody, do you want to know this? Information is good, especially when you're young, because you can change your diet, exercise, to kind of stretch out the amount of good life you have before you contract Alzheimer's. But my wife was really quite heroic about the whole thing. She says, I got bigger fish to kill because she had just finished a bout with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma 8 years ago, and she beat it, so far. But she says, look, and I'm going to die of NHL from lymphoma before Alzheimer's, so let's go ahead, especially for the kids and the grandkids. So we had all these PET scans done, and the DNA was, sampled, and EEGs, and all this stuff. So we just happened to have that for a completely different reason. So now the natural history of this was, when I started looking at our own PET scans, I noticed that there was one that really looked abnormal. And a friend had seen this, and she's an expert on the prefrontal cortex. She says, have you looked at your own PET scan? I said, yeah. And there's not too many people that would see it immediately, but she did. Good friend she is, but she didn't point it out. It was good to know.
So hang on, I just want to recap, Jim. You've got data anyway. You've got scans of the brain. You've got genetic information on the family, which you've taken for another purpose, for the Alzheimer's risk assessment, essentially. And now you're looking at it for something else.
From something else. And so in looking at it, everybody's brain looked normal. Everybody's PET scan looked normal, except mine. My pattern in the PET scanner, the orbital cortex had almost no activity, and it looked exactly the same as all of these psychopaths that I had been talking about and studying. And
so it's you. You're the one in the family with the images that suggest there's something wrong or something amiss with the brain.
Something different yes. Now, here, again, just looking at these scans, it could also mean that I'm a bon vivant and I just, happy-go-lucky people can have this pattern. But, of course, there's an overlap with sociopathy because people who are sociopathic also can be very happy-go-lucky and be superficially charming.
Yes. Now,
there is a connection there.
Now, Jim, we've talked about the brain structures, and we mentioned the genes as well before, the MAOA gene in particular.
Right.
What about that? Did you have that?
Well, we had not finished looking at all these genes. We looked at all the Alzheimer's-related ones and the other ones that we plan to look at. But now I started really to look at all the violence-related ones. So all those results came back just recently, in fact, at the end of last year. And there it was. So everybody, my wife had very, as we could have predicted, very low on hostility. And our 3 kids, our 2 daughters and the son, looked quite normal. They had a mix of high and low aggression genes. And also their PET scans, they all looked normal. They had good normal activity. Also, I had some of my brothers come. And now the second piece comes in, and this really started to freak me out. Because I had every single one of the these 10 high-risk alleles of these sort of warrior genes.
Right, so you've got the high-risk genes, you've got the PET scans that show a lack of activity in that particular part of the brain that's implicated. Can I just say at this point, Jim, if I haven't been sufficiently polite up till now, I'd like to apologise and become a lot more polite from now on.
You know, people don't mess with me too much in the past few months. You know, I found that out.
I can well believe it.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose the key thing is the childhood. What was your childhood like?
Well, yeah, I was born into a large family. The thing is, they all, I have all sorts of first and second cousins. You know, it's patriarchal and matriarchal side, big families. And my parents wanted to have a lot of kids, and so they had my brother, oldest brother, but then she had 5 or 6 miscarriages, 5 miscarriages. And this was a terrible thing, because they figured they'd never have any more kids. It would just be one. And I came out 5 years later, and so I was so loved just because I, came into the world, I guess by serendipity. So my grandparents, all my aunts and uncles, my parents, my siblings, everybody has always showered all of this love on me. Not because I'm a nice guy, but, I think primarily because I was, in a sense, a godsend. They figured that this was a sign, and they went on to have 6 kids, you see, and a big family. So that's probably why. So my whole upbringing was very, very sweet and very nurturing, very supportive.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because you have the biological raw material to be a born killer, but you're not, because you had a really good childhood.
Yeah, and if somebody had said this to me a year ago, I'd said they were full of it, because I really believed that genes had such a strong drive. You can modulate them a little bit, but the idea that you could take a biological tinderbox like this, genetically and in terms of brain activity, and really offset it by being showered with love. So, I can understand how stress can interact with the genome to turn somebody into, a psychopath. But the idea that you can be protected by being nurtured and loved so much, that really surprised me. So now this is kind of a hypothesis, and it's something I never would have thought would be really believable last year. But, the great thing about being a scientist is every month you find out how dead wrong you are on things. So.
Yes. Now, I have to ask, Jim, how did your wife and kids take this news?
Well, this is, there are levels to this that are a little, I guess, disquieting.